Bulletstorm VR is 2024's first big hitter, highly anticipated new VR game. And today I'm going to tell you why the Quest port in particular, on both Quest 2 and Quest 3, sadly falls pretty far short of greatness and lands in an uncomfortable and hard to recommend position. Now, Bulletstorm is a strange game. It originally released 13 years ago, back in 2011, and despite a complete edition re-release which launched in 2017, the franchise began and ended with that one installment. The game itself didn't exactly set the world on fire. It was a fairly solid and standard FPS that stood out thanks to its unique skill-based score-chasing kill system, and its crass potty-mouthed protagonists who spout off profanities endlessly during the game's 8 to 10 hour long campaign. Besides pushing your way through the story, which centres around a quest for revenge across an alien planet filled with gun-toting madmen and chunky monsters, the main goal of the game was to dispatch your enemies in creative ways, perhaps by kicking them off of a ledge or shoving them into a spiky wall, or maybe by whipping them up into the air and exploding them like a firework. There are countless ways to kill enemies in Bulletstorm, and I think that this gameplay mechanic more than anything else won it that nice little cult following of fans that it garnered over the years. Now, I for one am one of those fans. I didn't love the original in the same way that I love games like Dark Souls or the Resident Evil series, but it is a game I remember fondly, and I would have liked to see a sequel to it, something that built upon the original's foundations and took the skill-based kills to even wackier places. They really had something there. Figuring out how to achieve all the different kills to fill up the challenge-style tick list kept me playing for hours after the credits rolled, and it's had me revisiting the game a few times since its release. It basically felt like a murder-filled collectathon, and for a gamer who grew up playing Banjo-Kazooie, I really appreciated this concept in a more adult shooter. Flash forward to 2024 and we now have a VR re-release of the game for PSVR 2, PC VR and the Quest family of headsets. But after blasting through the campaign on Quest 3 over the last 2 weeks, I'm sitting here wondering if this one should have maybe stayed in 2011. Somehow the product we have here on Quest feels older than the original game, with some of the ugliest visuals I've seen on Quest for quite some time, poor performance issues ranging from frame drops and stutters all the way to hard crashes and shutdowns. The end result is a game that looks and feels much worse than the product we played 13 years ago. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. There is some fun to be had in Bulletstorm VR. If you can push deeper into the campaign to get your hands on some of the wide variety of weapons available to you, you'll no doubt create some grin-inducing moments during the game's over-the-top combat sections. There's no denying that the bigger gunfights can be great when you combine all the skills that you have available to you, and whipping characters towards yourself before Spartan kicking them off the cliffside will likely never get boring. But it's hard to enjoy the highs of Bulletstorm VR when the lows are so egregious right now. Do I think these issues are fixable? Yes, mostly. Patches to stabilise performance and improve visuals, particularly on Quest 3, are desperately needed and will fix most of the core problems, but the real question is when will we see them, and will it be too late? The good faith of those excited for launch is a powerful thing. If squandered, your game is tarnished with a certain public perception that's hard to shake, and in this instance it feels like Bulletstorm VR should have been delayed by at least another 6 months. Now, I've never really been one to complain too much about graphics in my games. If the core experience is enjoyable, then I can let some visual issues slide, but this is probably the most severe case I've encountered of a game losing its charm, personality and soul thanks to the visuals being so poor. I can't help but think about the wave of 1-star reviews that Asgard's Wrath 2 was hit with just over a month ago. A game that, in my opinion, looks absolutely stunning on standalone VR hardware and delivers a core experience so impressive, varied, polished and dense that I was genuinely blown away when people reacted so viscerally to its visual quality. And then I think about Bulletstorm VR. If people thought Asgard's Wrath 2 looked bad, they'll probably have some kind of aneurysm when they see this game running on the Quest. And the shocking thing is, it's a far less complex game than Asgard's Wrath 2. With linear levels and waves of baddies to shoot, it's the most basic run-and-gun gameplay formula around. A tried and tested experience that has served first-person shooters for 20 plus years now. The overall visual presentation in Bulletstorm VR on the Quest platform is painfully poor quality. Levels look jagged, flat, blurry, washed out, and uninteresting, especially in the early stages of the campaign that have you traipsing across the most bland brown planet you can imagine. But even when you arrive at the game's more beautiful and vibrant locations that really popped and looked amazing back on Xbox 360, you're still hit with ugly, pixelated renditions of these environments that are devoid of any atmosphere. I've never seen a game's personality impacted so hard by its visual downgrade. It feels like I ordered Bulletstorm from Wish.com, a strange, low-resolution version that does all the things Bulletstorm does, but doesn't look or feel anything like the product I remember. On Quest 3 there is a noticeable resolution bump, but that's the only current difference between the two versions. You'll just be playing a sharper version of the muddy, ugly Quest 2 port. Honestly, during my time with the game, it was common to see textures load in right in front of me. The complete absence of any kind of lighting or shadows made the whole game feel flat and lacking scale or depth, and I ultimately found myself sprinting through levels because stopping and smelling the roses just took me right out of any sense of immersion the game had ever achieved. I should also note that the game's cutscenes play out on floating screens in front of you, much like they do in Resident Evil 4. However, here they do play in 3D, so it's a bit like looking into a window or watching a 3D movie. But they are so low resolution and such low quality that you can basically count the pixels in the images you're shown. They aren't nice to look at, and I found myself skipping most of them. I really can see the Quest 3 crowd tearing this game's visuals to pieces on launch. It is in desperate need of some patching and enhancements because we now live in a world where games like Assassin's Creed Nexus, Asgard's Wrath 2, Red Matter 2, Resi Evil 4 and many more exist on the Quest platform. The bar has been lifted for standalone experiences, and currently Bulletstorm slides well below that bar. Gameplay is simultaneously the strongest aspect of Bulletstorm VR and oddly also the most dated. It's a type or style of first-person shooter that you will either love because you have a connection to this type of arcadey, fast-paced, score-based combat with no real weight to it, or you'll hate the fact that two-handing your weapon does nothing to change the stabilization and you'll wonder why enemies don't react to each bullet that connects with them. Bulletstorm comes from a very different time period, and when you drop it into a modern setting, it does feel like a product of its time. I for one don't mind the arcadey shooting and non-reactive enemies. It plays like it did back in the day, and that nostalgia for the original product is enough to keep me happy. But I can see this feeling woefully unimpressive to those jumping in now for the first time in 2024. As I've alluded to several times, the guns and skills you have as a player are probably the best aspect of this entire game. Using a revolver that can blast enemies up into the air like a rocket, or a shotgun that can cleave enemies in half, or a strange javelin throwing gun that pins enemies to walls is always going to be a great time. The weapons really shine in Bulletstorm VR, and when you have a decent selection of them at your disposal, things can get really creative and messy. Each weapon comes with its own tick list of creative kills to figure out and execute during the campaign, so there's an incentive to pick them all up and frequently swap between them in different areas and environments to attempt new, unique takedowns. It's a great mechanic, and it will keep players chopping and changing weaponry frequently throughout the campaign, experimenting with what's possible and mixing certain combos together. Make no mistake, Bulletstorm VR is an arcade shooter through and through, and this will no doubt be another point where players will either love or hate the experience on offer here. Guns don't have any weight to them. You can dual wield two of the biggest, heaviest guns if you like, and you'll feel no real penalty or recoil, and enemies will file in towards you and your AI controlled teammates, ready and willing to be destroyed. If you're looking for a nuanced, serious, simulation type shooter that makes you feel like you're actually holding these heavy futuristic weapons of destruction, then Bulletstorm VR will probably rub you the wrong way. It's a fast-paced, weightless game that is an arcade experience all the way through. Each of the campaign chapters are packed from end to end with shooting baddies and pushing forward through linear environments, and that's what you'll be doing for 80% of the campaign, with the other 20% reserved for a couple of really cool set-piece levels that are super unique and a lot of fun. My personal favourite is a level where you're fighting a giant Godzilla-sized creature as it smashes the city you're running through. But even if you do find yourself smiling from ear to ear, engaging in some seriously fun chaotic combat and thinking, damn, this game is actually pretty good, then you're probably not too far away from a nasty little performance issue that's ready to swoop in and ruin your day. During my time with Bulletstorm VR on the Quest 3, I encountered several hard crashes that would freeze the game and close it down, kicking me back to the Quest home screen without warning. Sometimes they would happen in the middle of a firefight, and others when I was just walking along from point A to point B. There seems to be no real rhyme or reason to them as of right now. I was able to replicate the crashes on Quest 2 as well, so it seems like this problem extends across the whole family of Quest devices at launch, meaning you could lose a chunk of progress or be pulled out of a particularly enjoyable section without a moment's notice if you hop on day one, regardless of the Quest headset you own. But crashing wasn't the only performance related issue. On Quest 3, the game frequently stutters and drops frames. It never feels like a particularly smooth experience for too long because moving into a new area or engaging with a new group of enemies often seem to cause the game to hang and hitch for a moment or two. I had battle music cutting out abruptly after killing enemies several times, leaving me wandering through levels in silence between encounters with bad guys. I encountered elements of the map not stitched together properly, gaps in terrain and environment that I could peer through into the abyss beyond the game world that I'm supposed to see. I had on-screen markers and HUD elements for guns not disappearing after holstering my weapons, meaning my view was impacted by little gun symbols until I quit a menu or reloaded a checkpoint. And I also had my AI companions walking through or disappearing through the floor when they were trying to navigate down a surface that wasn't even. The game feels fundamentally unfinished on the Quest, and it was throwing up performance-related issues every few moments. Issues that, when combined with the poor quality visuals, really paint a picture of a game that needed more time to cook, or potentially even of a dev team that was spread too thin to confidently tackle this project. Perhaps even a dev team that was split working on two fundamentally different versions of this game. For me personally, it feels like developers in Kuvo bit off more than they could chew when it came to releasing Bulletstorm VR simultaneously on 4 different platforms. Without playing the PC VR or PSVR 2 port, I am purely speculating, but my guess would be that the Quest and PSVR 2 version of the game is one and the same, and was developed separately from the PC VR port, meaning we have a much less impressive, much buggier, and much uglier console version on Quest standalone and potentially PSVR 2, and then a much nicer looking, impressive feeling version on PC VR. Now I say this for 2 reasons. Firstly, I've seen early reports from those who have played the PC VR version, and they have all been very positive, particularly about the game's visuals, some even going so far as to say they are stunning, something that could not be further from the experience I've had on Quest 2 and Quest 3. Secondly, I've seen this exact thing from Incuvo before. Green Hell VR has 2 distinctly different versions. There's the PC VR version, which is a true port of the flat game, with bigger, more open environments and far nicer visuals. And then there's a Quest and PSVR 2 version, which is a scaled down console VR reimagining with linear levels, lower quality visuals, and clever techniques that make the game seem bigger than it is. It feels like Incuvo's pipeline for work separates the Quest and PSVR 2 versions into one pot and the PC VR version into another separate pot, resulting in situations like this, where we have wildly different qualities of product across platforms and a game that isn't necessarily optimized for Quest 3 or PSVR 2 because it was built on the foundations of something made to run on the Quest 2. Now I could be way off base with this theory, and I won't know for sure until I can get my hands on the PSVR 2 and PC VR versions of the game, but from all the little rumblings I'm hearing across the VR community, it feels like I'm pretty close to nailing the situation we found ourselves in here, and it's a huge shame that PSVR 2 and Quest 3 players are left saddled with the most underwhelming version of a game that sounds potentially pretty great over on the PC. Now, conspiracy theory and speculation aside, what I can say definitively is Bulletstorm VR is a rough game on the Quest family of devices right now. There is fun to be had in the latter stages of the game for sure, and the combat is a real highlight when you're juggling multiple weapons and blasting enemies to pieces in hilariously creative ways. But the unbelievably poor visual quality, muddy washed out textures, blurry environments, and plethora of performance issues that range from hard crashes and shutdowns to stutters and frame drops make this new version of a 13-year-old game feel bizarrely older and more dated than its flat screen counterpart. In an attempt to revitalise the game and deliver it to a new audience, Incuvo have instead driven me back to the flat screen game to experience it with all the colour, vibrance and personality that made the game so charming in the first place, because sadly on the Quest, it currently feels like a cheap imitation of the product it's trying to reinvent.